went for the surgery because I thought I was going to get paralyzed.
One part of his spine was not getting spinal fluid, and it was trapped.
For 50 years, the world believed one truth. Ozzy Osbourne was indestructible, the Prince of Darkness who bit the heads off bats, survived decades of impossible addiction, and built a legend on being unbreakable. But on July 22nd, 2025, that legend shattered.
The godfather of heavy metal and Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne, has passed away at the age of 76.
As the world mourned, a darker truth surfaced. His death wasn't a quiet end to a long life, but the devastating outcome of a secret crisis he'd hidden for over 40 years. Because the real cause of his death wasn't listed on a coroner's report. It was hidden in the foundation of the fragile kingdom he spent a lifetime building. A kingdom designed to protect the man, but one that ultimately imprisoned the myth. A scream louder than the silence. Before he was the Prince of Darkness, he was a terrified kid from Birmingham, and his entire career was a desperate attempt to outrun the demons that chased him from childhood. It all came crashing down in 1979. At the absolute peak of Black Sabbath's fame, his own bandmates, the men Ozzy considered brothers, cast him out of the very empire he had helped build. The reason was simple and brutal. His addiction was so out of control, so profoundly destructive, that even the godfathers of heavy metal couldn't handle him anymore. He had become a liability to the dark empire he helped build. For the world, it was a shocking rock and roll drama. For Ozzy, it was the first time his private hell had publicly consumed him. That hell had its roots in the cold, gray streets of post-war Aston, Birmingham. Born John Michael Osbourne, he grew up in a working-class family, feeling, in his own words, like a peasant. His home was a place of constant struggle, and the world outside was no kinder. Plagued by learning disabilities and haunted by the industrial gloom, he was a boy drowning in silence and fear. Music was never just a career choice. It was an escape. When he stepped up to a microphone with his first band, the sound that came out wasn't just singing, it was a primal scream. It was the sound of a boy trying to be louder than the silence that had terrified him his entire life. Black Sabbath, with its heavy, doom-laden riffs, was the perfect vessel for his rage and pain. It was a sound that resonated with millions, turning 4 working-class kids into global superstars. But with every sold-out stadium, the ticking time bomb inside him wound tighter. The fame, the money, the adoration. It was everything he'd ever wanted, but it wasn't enough to quiet the demons. In fact, it only gave them more room to grow. While the world saw the wild, unpredictable showman on stage, behind the curtain, a far more dangerous story was unfolding. The shy, insecure boy from Birmingham was still there, and he was terrified. He used alcohol and drugs to build the persona of Ozzy, the invincible madman. It was a mask that allowed him to perform, but it was also a poison that was slowly eating him alive. After being cast out of Sabbath, he should have faded away, another rock and roll casualty. But he didn't. With his new manager and future wife Sharon, he clawed his way back from the brink. He found a guitarist who was more than a musician. He was a prodigy. His name was Randy Rhoads. Together, they forged a new sound, one that was both ferociously heavy and brilliantly melodic. The release of Blizzard of Oz in 1980 wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. Ozzy was bigger than ever. He was a solo superstar, a god of rock who had stared into the abyss and returned more powerful than before. Albums like Diary of a Madman cemented his new status, and the tours were legendary spectacles of rock and roll excess. He had more fame, more money, and more power than he'd ever had with Black Sabbath. But this massive success only raised the stakes. It gave him so much more to lose, making the secrets he kept even more dangerous. The looming shadow of his addiction grew longer and darker with every platinum record. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. The pressure of being Ozzy Osbourne fueled his need for substances. And the substances allowed him to keep being Ozzy Osbourne. He was on top of the world, a creative and commercial titan. But he was also standing at the edge of a cliff, just moments away from a fall that would shatter his world and begin a secret, lifelong downfall. The crash that changed everything. At the height of his power, a horrific tragedy would expose a secret weakness in Ozzy Osbourne, a wound that never healed and would ultimately lead to a decades-long private health crisis he was forced to hide from the world. By early 1982, Ozzy wasn't just a rock star, he was an institution. He was the definitive heavy metal frontman, a man who had not only survived being fired from his own legendary band, but had become even more successful without them. With Randy Rhoads by his side, he seemed creatively and commercially untouchable. The music was groundbreaking, the shows were legendary, and the Prince of Darkness persona was iconic. He was, by every measure, invincible. And then, on March 19th, 1982, that invincibility was shattered forever. While on tour in Florida, Randy Rhoads, along with two others, took a small private plane for a joyride. The plane buzzed the tour bus where Ozzy was sleeping, trying to wake him. On the third pass, a wing clipped the bus, sending the plane spiraling out of control into a nearby house, erupting in a massive fireball. Everyone on board was killed instantly. This wasn't just the death of a friend and collaborator. It was the core trauma of Ozzy Osbourne's life. The shock, the horror, and the profound survivor's guilt broke something inside him that would never fully heal. The public saw a grieving rock star, but the reality was far worse. The secret crisis had begun. In the immediate aftermath, Ozzy was not a performer. He was a walking ghost, a man hollowed out by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. Sharon found him in a state of catatonic shock, a man whose spirit had been torn from his body. It was in this crucible of loss that the unholy pact was forged. The public persona of the madman would no longer be just an act. It would become a shield, a fortress of chaos built to protect the shattered man inside. The world wanted the Prince of Darkness, so he would give them a performance so convincing that no one would dare look for the vulnerability beneath. This was the wound that would fester in private for the next 40 years, the origin point of the physical and mental decline he would fight so hard to conceal. From that moment on, his life became a battle fought on two fronts. Publicly, he maintained the madness, continuing to tour and record, building the Ozzy myth into a global brand. The substance abuse, once a component of his rock star lifestyle, now became a desperate attempt to numb the void, to drown the ghosts of that fiery morning in Florida. The relentless touring schedule was no longer just about ambition. It was a flight from memory, a way to keep moving so the guilt couldn't catch up. Privately, his body began to pay the price for the decades of chemical self-flagellation and the unresolved trauma. His nervous system was under constant siege, his physical resilience worn down to a thread. The 80s and 90s were a blur of sold-out arenas and escalating self-destruction, each show a triumph for the brand and a micro-defeat for the man. The first major public crack in his physical armor came in 2003, when he suffered a near-fatal ATV accident on his English estate. He broke his collarbone, 6 ribs, and a vertebra in his neck. The man who seemed indestructible was suddenly revealed to be terrifyingly mortal. He recovered, but the damage was permanent, a physical manifestation of the brokenness he'd carried inside for 2 decades. Then, in 2019, a fall at his home became the devastating blow that began his final decline. The fall dislodged the metal rods put in his back from the ATV accident years earlier, leading to a cascade of agonizing health problems and multiple grueling spinal surgeries. But even this wasn't the full story. The entire time, he was hiding a far more terrifying secret. In an interview, his wife Sharon later revealed that Ozzy had first been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease all the way back in 2003, the same year as his ATV crash. For nearly 2 decades, he kept this degenerative neurological disease a secret from the world. The stakes for keeping this hidden were immense. The legend of Ozzy Osbourne was built on power, chaos, and indestructibility. How could the Prince of Darkness admit he was battling a disease that caused tremors, stiffness, and a slow, cruel erosion of the body? A revelation like that would have shattered the myth. It would have meant the end of touring, the end of the persona, the end of the empire he and Sharon had so carefully built. And so, he fought his war in secret. The stage itself became the perfect camouflage. The shuffling gait, the slight unsteadiness, the trembling hands. To an audience, this was just Ozzy being Ozzy, the glorious, chaotic mess they paid to see. In reality, it was an artist masterfully and tragically, weaving the symptoms of his own neurological decay into his performance. He endured the pain, the surgeries, and the terrifying progression of his illness behind closed doors. Sharon described the silent agony of watching him, saying, "I'm sad for myself to see him that way, but what he goes through is worse. And sometimes when I look at him and he doesn't know I'm looking at him, I'm crying." That was the shocking truth. While the world saw the madman, the reality was a man in constant pain, fighting a losing battle against his own body, haunted by a tragedy that had broken his spirit 4 decades earlier. Ozzy's final performance and the long goodbye. As his body failed him, Ozzy Osbourne would orchestrate one last, monumental act, a final performance that was more than a concert. It was a carefully planned goodbye he delivered just before the end. The final years of his life were a slow, public retreat. The fallout from his health crises was unavoidable. His farewell tour, announced with great fanfare, was postponed again and again due to infections, surgeries, and his worsening Parkinson's. The media storm was relentless, with tabloids speculating wildly about his condition. Each canceled date, each frail public appearance, chipped away at the myth of his invincibility. Through it all, Sharon Osbourne became his fierce protector, managing the narrative with a masterful grip. Her public statements were a clinic in damage control, always hopeful, always emphasizing his fighting spirit, while carefully concealing the true, devastating extent of his decline. She was no longer just his wife and manager, she was the guardian of his legacy, fighting to ensure he would be remembered as a titan, not as a victim of his own frailty. But as his condition worsened, they both knew that time was running out. They decided he would have the final word. That final word came on July 5th, 2025. The event was called Back to the Beginning, a one-night-only charity show in his hometown of Birmingham. This wasn't a comeback, it was a farewell. Unable to stand on his own, Ozzy performed seated on a massive custom-built throne decorated with bat wings, a perfect, poignant symbol of his reign. Dressed in black with his signature dark eye makeup, he looked every bit the Prince of Darkness, even as his body betrayed him. He sang his greatest hits from Crazy Train to Mama, I'm Coming Home, his voice still powerful, cutting through the night air. At the end of the show, the music faded, and he looked out at the 40,000 fans, his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice thick. "I've been laid up for like 6 years. You have no idea how I feel. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." He blew kisses to the roaring crowd as fireworks lit up the sky behind him. It was a perfect, heartbreaking farewell. Just 17 days later, on the morning of July 22nd, 2025, the world received the news it had long dreaded, but was still not ready for. Ozzy Osbourne had passed away at the age of 76. The family released a statement confirming he had died peacefully, surrounded by love. The timing was no coincidence. He had held on, fighting through unimaginable pain for one last moment on stage. He endured just long enough to say goodbye to his fans in his city on his own terms. Tributes poured in from around the globe. Elton John called him a true legend. Metallica posted a simple broken heart. The world mourned a rock god. But the truth was more complex. They were mourning a man who had orchestrated his own final curtain call, delivering the performance of a lifetime before quietly letting go. The man behind the madman. In the end, the greatest secret of the Prince of Darkness wasn't about the darkness at all, but about the profound, hidden fragility of the man behind the myth. We followed the journey of a terrified boy from Birmingham, who screamed his way to global stardom, only to be haunted by the very fame he chased. The shocking truth behind his death wasn't a single event, but a lifetime of hidden pain. A chain reaction started by a horrific tragedy that crippled his spirit, and followed by a secret decades-long war against his own failing body. His final performance wasn't just a concert. It was the last chapter of his story, written on his own terms. His legacy is not just in the millions of albums sold or the stadiums he filled. It's in the raw, unfiltered humanity he ultimately revealed. He was a man who lived through unimaginable highs and devastating lows, hiding his deepest wounds behind a mask of madness until the very end. But this leaves us with one final haunting question. Was Ozzy Osbourne's final concert the ultimate act of defiance from a rock legend? Or was it the tragic final confession of a man who knew he was out of time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What is your favorite Ozzy memory? For more incredible stories that reveal the truth behind the legends, Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.